I'm Natasha Duarte. I am one of the co-founders with Dr. Kristen Allett of the Protein for All program. I'm acting as moderator today. And yeah, I'll just start by introducing Dr. Allett. Kristen is a naturopathic physician and highly regarded national speaker who is passionate about assisting individuals and organizations to optimizing brain performance to improve decision-making, creativity, and health. For more than a decade, Dr. Allett has refined her expertise on how to promote increased mental functioning by treating the physical causes of fatigue, depression, and sugar cravings. She also consults with the University of Washington's Court Improvement Training Academy to improve energy, mental clarity, and resilience of all individuals in the court dependency system. As Dr. Allett has a clinical practice as well, so just to be clear, this training is for educational and informational purposes only, and nothing from any of the handouts or this webinar is intended to constitute medical advice, consultation, recommendation, diagnosis, or treatment. And also there were handouts. We will be referring to them during today's webinar, and they're available at proteinforall.org/CASA-Maricopa. So you can find them there. And with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Allett.
Thank you, Natasha. I am really excited for this seminar, and thank you for all of you for taking the time to join us, and thank you, Rosie and Carlita, on setting it up, because they've done a lot of back-end work to get this started and going. So, Protein for All. Part of what we're going to be talking about today is this sort of grassroots movement that kind of formed itself, and I'm helping to mature. And what Protein for All is a program that partners with organizations to help with primary trauma and reduce secondary trauma to improve in-the-moment decision-making, creativity, and health. Well, what does that mean? Well, let me give you a little background on how this started and a little background on me so that the context makes sense. So in '91, I worked with adolescents in psychiatric crisis, and I was a biology major, and they handed me the DSM, which is the manual that diagnoses mental health problems, and said, here, read this. This is the medical manual. And a couple of weeks later, gave it back and said, this isn't a medical manual. There's no biology in it. And by the way, I qualify for most of it because I tend to be a pain in the ass and have depression, anxiety, and all the things that people had. Like, I couldn't understand that. But I was working with kids in psychiatric crisis as a biology major, and I just want to tell you kind of one story that really stuck with me. We had this kid, John, come in, and John was 16 years old and 5'9" and 180 pounds and lifted weights. And when he didn't get his way, he hit adults and sent them to the hospital, much like his father hit him and other adults and sent them to the hospital. It was sort of a family affair of things. And so, you know, John had grown up in a house with a lot of violence and verbal violence, and that's just what had been role modeled. So he got pulled in, and we put kids on a behavior plan, and he just aced the first day. He got all of his points, and when you get all your points, you get a treat, and he opted for a Snickers bar. And 2 hours later, we were trying to restrain this really big kid who had a lot of skills, and he was just completely out of control and very angry. And we were like, wow, okay. And so the next day, new system, new day, all of his points, and he had to do really hard things like the MMPI, and he was really engaged and really sweet and really nice, and we gave him a Snickers bar at the end of the day because that's what he chose, and he tried to kill us again, and we were like, wow, that's horrible and scary. And so we got big staff member in, and they're talking about maybe Sundowner's syndrome or something like that. So the third day, we alternated who was in charge, and the third day I was in charge, and I went to Kmart and got those little toys with men with guns and bayonets and lobbing grenades. And when John got all of his points, because he was good at getting all of his points, and he was really engaged in all the therapeutic things we were asking him to do, and he was allowed to get a treat. And I said, how about toys? And he's like, sure, I'll do toys. I'm kind of tired of Snickers bars. We had a great evening. I got more toys, and the fourth night, more great time. The fifth night, he went back to the Snickers bar, and all hell broke loose. And once things settled out, I was sitting with him, and I was like, John, what? Like, why 2 good days? And he's like, I don't know, but I think I need to stay away from Snickers bars. I like getting my way. I don't like hurting people, but sometimes I don't know how to stop it. And he really stuck with me, and we're going to talk about the physiology of what was happening with John and why he was figuring out that he needed to stay away from Snickers bars. So then fast forward, I become a naturopathic physician, and I specialize in mental health, non-pharmaceutical interventions for mental health, worked a lot with depression, anxiety, PTSD, and complex trauma, and find that food really helps. And I do speaking, and I was asked to speak to Superior Court judges about how to optimize their brain. So not only are we going to talk about how to help kids do better, but we're also going to talk about how to help ourselves do better, particularly how to have more energy and mental clarity, because when we have good energy and mental clarity, we have better decision making. And so we went through the physiology, and we're going to talk about the physiology of not eating or not eating foods that have protein in it. And Parent Allies in Washington, we have this organization called Parent Allies, and these are parents who lost their kids to dependency court because of poverty and lack of education and some addiction, and they went and worked on the addiction, and they got an education, and they did everything that the court asked them to do, and they actually got their kids back, and then they come back into the court to help other parents navigate the dependency court system, which is CASA workers, you volunteers, you all know how complicated it is. And they came up to me after listening to this talk that was directed at judges for their own well-being and said, so if I hadn't eaten for 2 days before my children were taken away, is that why I couldn't understand what the judge was saying to me? And I'm like, if I hadn't eaten in 2 days, I couldn't understand a cartoon. And they're like, so if we hand a protein bar to somebody before they go to court, will they understand what's going on better? I'm like, yes. And that's how Protein for All was born, in that, like, we all have opportunities if we understand the science to meet. We're not going to solve food insecurity, and we're not going to solve a lot of complexity about poverty and historic trauma in families, but we can, for some individuals, make the moment a little better and feed their brain so that they can, in that moment, understand and hear what's going on, because their smart brain is what's the information is going through, versus their not so smart brain, which is what we call the lizard brain. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about. I just wanted to give you a little context before we begin. So we're going to just jump right into the science now that we've talked a little bit up. So this is just a quote from a Parent Ally. The power of Protein for All is that it is an act of compassion, and it helps people's brains be at their best the days that it counts. So one more story. I was working with a foster care caseworker, and sometimes when you go pick up foster care, and I bet you as CASA workers have this challenge sometimes, you go to the kid's home, or you talk to them at school, and they haven't eaten in a while, and they're really dysregulated, and they don't want to go with you because that's triggering to them. And so she knew that that was a problem. And she started implementing Protein for All. And what she would do is she would bring box of juice and nuts to the foster care family and have everybody sit down at the dining room table and eat a little juice and nuts. And then she would look at Martha and be like, hey, Martha, we got to go. And Martha would just get up and go rather than having a fight or be doing a restraint or all the things. And it took her a little more time, except for it saved her time because she didn't have to do a restraint or have her run away and do the paperwork. So just making sure that people's brains have been recently fed, they'll start making new decisions. So let's look at what this means. So we're going to go through the education. Hopefully you've all been educated about the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Events Study. And I just want to bring this up. There was a study done out of Kaiser with middle class Americans, and what they found is that when adverse childhood events added up, people were more likely to have physical as well as mental health problems, including ranging from asthma and diabetes to smoking and addictions and going to jail. And why this happens is that when kids have adverse childhood events, their system gets supercharged into a sympathetic nervous system. And so then their social and emotional and cognitive skills start to decline. And when our bodies are supercharged with adrenaline all the time, we also will manage that through using drugs or alcohol to feel better. And we also rely on sugar, and then we start having more disease and disability and obesity and diabetes and depression and anxiety and bipolar, and then we don't do well in life. I couldn't find statistics for Arizona. I apologize, but I just want to, and I'm sure you've seen this, but like there's a lot happening in households that are hard on kids, ranging from having somebody with mental illness to prison to substance abuse. And part of what the movement that we're moving towards is like how to give kids more resilience. I was talking to Wendy when she came in about why she enjoys doing CASA, and part of what CASA volunteers do is they help the kids have more resilience because they have adults in their lives who believe in them. So how I think about the people is that it is our body that provides our power supply. And so we want to monitor our energy and mental clarity, because if we don't have a lot of energy, then it's really hard for our brain to work. And it's really hard for us to engage in relationships. And so the brain, we're going to talk a little bit about the brain and what happens with trauma, but I also want, and how food affects it, but I also want to put a plug in that healthy relationships and supportive relationships also is a factor in terms of helping our mind emerge and having our mind be engaged. So what is our mind? It's a emergent property. So in Washington, we all believe in clouds. A cloud is an emergent property that arises out of water and wind and atmospheric pressures. And we all understand that if we're in a plane, we can't capture a cloud, it disappears. And the mind is the same way. So last season, I had a really bad cold and I had no mind. It was just all brain saying, drink water, make sure the rest of the family is alive, as with that horrible flu went through. So part of, we want to make sure that our brain and our body are fed so that our mind can have the clarity to be curious and compassionate and engaged and engage in healthy relationships. Hopefully that makes sense for people. And And if you have questions, I'm going to go through the science and then we're going to take a break. But if you have questions, I can always back up. So let's first check in on what your power supply is. And just how are you doing? Like where do you usually run? You know, maybe today is a 5 because you stayed up late, but generally you're running between 8 and maybe dropping down to a 6 on a really busy day. Or are you a 5 to a 3? And if you're a 5 to a 3, that's hard to do extra. And it's a setup for both physical and mental health problems. So I'm always encouraging people to monitor their own power supply, which is partly how we protect ourselves against secondary trauma, is to make sure that we have the energy and our body and brain have the energy to understand that the stories that we might hear that are tragic are not our stories. And that actually takes a lot of energy to separate out. So there's this amazing book coming out that I just happened to get an early copy of by Casey Gwen and Chan Hellerman out of the University of Oklahoma. And Chan Hellerman has been researching hope for 10 years. Like, what is how do we have people hope for a better future, for instance? And he's been studying this in the context of kids who have had domestic violence and other adverse childhood events. And what he has found is that you need 2 things in order to have hope to reach a goal, which is different than a wish. A wish is something that you want to have happen that there's no way of achieving. Like, I wish to go beyond the moon. However, that is not a goal. I am not putting any energy or personal investment into making that happen. But if somebody asked, I would say yes. And so that's a wish versus a hope, which is something that you have willpower for and way power. So the way power is a mental road that allows you to make small achievements. Willpower is personal investment and brain smart nutrition. And this is partly what I really saw with people with addictions and PTSD, is when they stabilize their brain nutrition, then their personal investment became more probable, and they were better able to walk down the path to recovery and having a fantastic life. And teaching this to kids is so important, that they can hope for things and that they can create roadmaps of how that might happen and have the personal investment to do that and feed their brain so that they don't get distracted. So let's go into the science so we understand that a little better. So what studies show is that when our brain does not have a fuel supply through glucose, which we call hypoglycemia, we have decreased attention span, decreased emotional regulation, and decreased ability to cope with stress, as well as increased criminality, aggression, impulsive behavior, and addiction. So now we're going to reflect a little bit about back to John, the kid who got so aggressive with us, in that, maybe 2 hours after a Snickers bar, he was hypoglycemic, which is why, although he wanted his way, he didn't have the tools to do it in any other way but what his survival brain had been taught, which is through aggression. So willpower is more than a metaphor. One of the saddest things that I see is when people are talking about wanting to have more willpower to lose weight, and then they cut food out of their life, which then gives them less willpower, and then at 10 o'clock at night they polish off a bag of donuts or Ben & Jerry's ice cream or Doritos and eat more calories than they normally would even eat. And part of that is that study after study shows that we need carbohydrates and glucose in order to have willpower. And right now, because you're all doing an act of willpower, you're either sitting in a room with people or sitting on a computer, which might be a little weird, and this person's talking to you and you may be somewhat engaged or somewhat not engaged, and it's taking brain fuel to do this. I did a talk with domestic violence and found this study that what we find is that people who are violent or are violent offenders have less glucose in their frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe is the part of our brain that improves our decision making. We'll talk a little more about that. So this is again John, so how does this work? So let's take somebody who's either having a panic attack, which I call 10 out of 10, or extreme anger. For me, extreme anger is yelling, hitting, and it is beyond a 10, like it's just yelling and maybe throwing things not at somebody. So that's 10 out of 10. What I find is when we stabilize somebody's blood glucose, at minimum, their anxiety or their anger drops to a 7. So at a 7, like, you can have some cognitive choices on how you're going to behave. You can either disengage, or if you're anxious, you can start using tools such as breathing. But when you're at a 10 out of 10, most people have to just write it out. So here's the study on how I got to talk to judges. And for those of you who are online and have access to a chat box, I would just love a little feedback. I'm going to do a little Q&A, so you can open up your chat boxes. And maybe Rosie, you can kind of do a round of questions when I ask a question. So they took judges who are reading files for parole, and they thought they were in an implicit bias study. So looking at, did they make different decisions about race or gender, and in fact, they were in a study looking at when they last had their meal. And so immediately after a meal, what they found is the judges would put in the pile of consider for parole 65% of the files that they read. So what do you think was happening immediately before a meal? How many of the people were considered for parole basically an hour earlier? Any guesses? You can type into your chat box, and Rosie, you can ask people just to call out numbers, and then maybe you can put that into the chat box real quick. So I see a 20%. Any other guesses? I see a 35%. 18.
Yeah, we're guessing about 20% here.
Okay. Yay, thanks for your participation. So here's the big reveal. 0. Like 0. Like, that's really scary. And this was across lots of different judges. And it was all the same, that their lizard brain was deciding that safety and no is always going to be the answer. Where their prefrontal cortex, when their prefrontal cortex had fuel, they could see the whole of the person a little better. So this is how I get to talk in front of judges and lawyers always raise their hand and they're like, how do I know when a judge is going to have lunch? And I was like, you're going to have to figure that one out yourself. Maybe some of you've noticed, like, I just laid out a pretty good argument that we should just be eating sugar all the time. Anybody hear that message? Hopefully someone, and you're like, oh, I now can eat sugar all the time and I am justified. Yeah, kind of. So there's an amazing researcher by the name of Felice Jacka, and she did a big study on adults, and it was a retrospective study. And what she found is adults who are eating highly processed foods had a tendency for more depression and anxiety. And people criticized that study. And so she got funding for 3,000 adolescents, which is a big number. And it was a prospective study. So they followed them over time. And what they found is that the higher the quality of the diet, the higher the quality of mental health. And the lower the quality of the diet, the more mental health problems the adolescents have. And over that time period, some adolescents got access to better nutrition, and some adolescents got access to worse nutrition, and their mental health scores trended the same way as their health. And this applies to adults as well. This is the adult study. So now we're going to jump off into the physiology, and particularly here, if there's something you don't understand, please ask a question, because I really want you to understand this, and I'm really used to being able to look at a room and get people's facial feedback as I go, and so I always get a little nervous when I'm doing it online. So let's look what happens when we eat different substances. So most people, when they have breakfast in the morning, it tends to be cereal or a scone or a piece of toast. And when we have just carbohydrates without any clear protein source, what happens is our blood glucose goes up, and then it comes back down. The food is converted into glucose, and then how the food gets out of our bloodstream and into cells is through a hormone called insulin. And I think insulin is this really cool hormone because it's our only storage hormone. We have lots of hormones that'll pull things out of storage, but insulin is the only thing that puts it into cells. And so as the insulin comes and the glucose gets swept in the cells, the glucose in our bloodstream will drop. And our brain will have a sufficient glucose supply for 1 to 2 hours. Oh, there's that 2-hour window again that I started with John, in that the Snickers bar gave him a fuel supply for about 2 hours. Part of why we like sugar and Snickers bars, and I won't go through all the physiology, but I don't know, when I have a bad day, I usually reach for sugar. There's 5% of the population that'll reach for fat, but mostly people reach for sugar. And why that is because we get tryptophan into our brain, which then makes serotonin, and serotonin tells our lizard brain everything's okay. And when we've had a hard day, we're not sure that everything's okay. But what happens when we continue to not fuel ourselves after having mainly carbohydrates, if we don't get another fuel supply, what happens is adrenaline kicks in. And adrenaline, along with a whole bunch of other hormones, but adrenaline has implications that we're going to cover for both our physical body and our brain, which affects our mental health. So generally how we cope with this is we just eat sugar every 2 hours. That's how we make sure that we don't get an adrenaline hit. And certainly I did this in medical school. I was just eating every 2 hours. This is partly why people walk around with 32 ounces of Coca-Cola, is that they're just mainlining sugar so that they can stay in their smart part of their brain. These are often people who are near homelessness that are trying to do this. Adolescents will also do this when they don't have enough people around them or structure around them, and they feel like they have to make all their decisions on their own. Because it's a smart technique. And this is why, when we're in an office and there's always that person who has a candy jar, like you just keep going by and like you tell yourself you're not going to do it, but you'll do it because your brain's saying, hey, if we don't do that, you're going to get really uncomfortable and I don't want to do that. And we have 200 emails to respond to. So let's talk about what happens when we do hit the adrenaline button. There's many ways to slice and dice a brain, but we're going to put the brain in this context. So there's the cortex, which is our smart brain. which is responsive and innovative and problem solving and memory. Then we have our middle prefrontal cortex, which is called executive functioning. This is attention and emotion and planning and behavior. And when we have no adrenaline in our system, the smart part of our brain receives all the sensory input from the outside world. So what we see, smell, taste, hear, and touch comes to the smart part of our brain. Our smart part of the brain does the calculation and says, we should do this about the fact that this is happening. When we have adrenaline in the system, and it doesn't matter if we have adrenaline in the system because our boss yelled at us or because we have gone too long without eating, all of our sensory input gets dropped into our lizard brain. And our lizard brain is going to make a couple of really simple decisions because this is our survival brain. So there's flight, fight, disappear, and reactive past behaviors. And so anxiety, this is our panic attack. This is fighting. This is John who wanted to hit everything. Disappear. Some people, when they get a lot of adrenaline in the system, they want to disappear into Facebook or Ben & Jerry's ice cream or drugs or alcohol. Where basically we're putting on blinders and saying, this is all I want to pay attention to because I know the emotional context will stay about the same here. And then we also start, we are hardwired for lots of different behaviors that we really don't think much about. So most of us don't think about what streets to drive on to drive home. We just get in the car, turn the key, and the brain just takes care of it, and we have all sorts of other thoughts just getting there. And that's really important to have those pre-programmed behaviors. Get up in the morning, put on clothes, for instance. That's a really good one. Get up in the morning, brush your teeth. That's a really good one. But sometimes we have hardwired in behaviors that we want to change, so such as an addiction pattern. A common thing that I see in addictions is people's cortex says, I really want to stop addictions, my addiction. I really want to get it together. However, they aren't fed, they go too long without eating, they go to the grocery store, they buy a bag full of groceries. They never consciously said, I'm going to buy a bottle of wine, and they get home and there is in the bag is a bottle of wine. My experience is mostly they drink it. Every once in a while, somebody's cortex can sit down on that lizard brain and say, we don't drink alcohol anymore, and so throw it away. But mostly we start again the next day. But people feel a lot of shame about not being in charge of their lizard brain. And this is true for kids, in that kids know how to behave, but when they are full of adrenaline, the teenagers in my house get a little snarky. they start flipping a lot of attitude. They don't really like flipping a lot of attitude, but in our household, when we have a teenager who's flipping attitude, we get them a lizard brain treat. We'll talk about that in a minute, but it's really important to recognize when people's lizard brain is in charge. I see that there's a couple of questions. And we're going to get to what to do. So I like the questions, but I'm not seeing anything on these specific slides. I see that people are putting the information into application, which is awesome.
One quick question,
Yep.
Kristen, that is a little bit related. In terms of caffeine, like you talked about people walking around with a big soda.
Yeah.
Is that the same with a big thing of coffee?
Yeah, so caffeine makes you hypervigilant. That's why you feel awake. It's the same thing as making you hypervigilant. And so when people are, I mean, at least in my world, the people that I see walking around with a lot of, certainly professionals walk around with a lot of caffeine. But when people are using caffeine as a survival technique, part of that is that they feel like they have to stay hypervigilant to stay to stay alive. And as long, and so quick, I'll just talk about caffeine. You know, if people are drinking caffeine and it's 2 regular cups of coffee, you know, not 16 ounces of coffee or lattes or whatever you're doing, and you're doing it before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you're not having panic attacks, I don't care how much caffeine people are drinking. If you're doing more than 2, usually that's saying you're fatigued, and you should probably work with somebody to figure out why you're fatigued. But caffeine and panic attacks are additive because the caffeine is making you hypervigilant. So let's continue on with the science. We're going to talk a little bit about PTSD now. And so what happens to the brain when people are repeatedly exposed to trauma is that the adrenaline keeps coming in, and so everything keeps getting dumped into the lizard brain, and information stops going to the smart part of our brain. And in fact, over time, the hippocampus will shrink, and so the executive decision making and all decisions are done through the lizard brain. And so part of what when I talk to judges, they're like, I don't understand why the parents won't engage. And part of the reason why they feel different is if they grew up in a household where there was a lot of adverse childhood events, that maybe they have their own problems that they haven't resolved. And it's not so simple to just change your mind. They have to partly change their brain. And so this slide sort of helps break that out. When people basically grow up in a safe environment with little trauma, I mean, I think everybody gets some trauma, but for the most part, little or no trauma. They consider that that they're safe in the world, that the world is reasonably benign, and the future is reasonably hopeful and manageable. Like they think that they can hope for the future and walk towards that down a path and get it. But if you have grown up in a household of trauma, you're always vulnerable. And some people are so vulnerable that they actually lose their sense of self. And so they have to work with therapists to redevelop that. The world is always threatening. So, and I'm sure as CASA workers, you've experienced this where you're like, I'm a really nice person. And the kids are like, no, you're not. And it's not that you're not, it's that it's a better assumption for them to assume threat. And it's a better assumption for them to assume that the future is uncontrollable and unpredictable. And so just really staying in the present moment of like, whatever happens, happens kind of thing, because they don't know, they've never experienced having control. Let's talk about what happens to the body when we go too long without eating. So we have declining glucose to the brain. The brain says, whoa, we can't deal with the emails and driving and music and all the input. And so we need more glucose, hits the adrenaline button, we get some cortisol. Glucose is made for the brain. Fat tissue, always available for deposit. Like part of our history is that we for a long time, we lived where food was not enough. And so if there is food to be stored, fat tissue will store it and keep it for a really long time. We cannot make glucose out of fat. We can only make it out of protein. And so protein either comes from our diet or it comes from our muscle mass. Our muscle mass sets our metabolic rate, which determines how many calories we get to eat. My reading of both physical and mental health is that muscle mass is the biggest determinant of both physical and mental health. So partly because muscle mass helps prevent diabetes. It's really hard to get type 2 diabetes with a lot of muscle mass. And as far as I'm concerned, all Americans are running towards type 2 diabetes because we're just eating way too many carbohydrates. Brain fertilizer, so there's something called brain-derived neurotropic factor. It's one of many neurotropic peptides, and that means brain fuel. Tropic is sort of fertilizer, and a peptide is an amino acid. So brain-derived neurotropic factor helps us learn faster so that we don't have to have as many exposures in order to learn. And so, for instance, there's a school in Aurora, Illinois, that started exercising their kids for an hour every morning. And they went from lowest math scores, lowest English scores, to highest world math scores, not just US math scores, but world math scores, simply because the kids were getting exercise. And it helps us have more energy and mental clarity. So one of the things that I want to try, and this is the first time that I try it because I don't know how to do this quite online, is I want you to check in again. So we've been sitting here for a little bit and your energy and mental clarity might be declining. So just think about that chart and what your energy level is at this moment. And now what I want you to do is you're all seated and I want you to, we're going to do 10, wave our hands and clap if it's okay to make noise. And if it's not okay to make noise, then don't clap, but wave your hands, and we're going to do that 8 times. If you have bad shoulders, you can do something else. You can lift your knees and march in place, or stand up and march in place. I will leave the screen if not. So here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Awesome. So first of all, what I've done is I've just put a whole bunch of brain-derived neurotropic factor into your brain, so you're more likely to learn this material. That was pretty sneaky of me. And the other thing I want you to do is check in and see what your energy level is. Hopefully, it's a little better. Everybody has to find out what their sort of minimal amount of movement that they need in order to feel better. But generally what I find is like 4 air squats. Somebody said feeling good. Awesome. 4 air squats or moving your hands. Like it doesn't take much. And sometimes we make exercise so such a big deal. Like we got to go to the gym and we got to do an hour and we got to like, yes, that's all really important for the body and weight management and all of those things. But right now, we're just focused on our brain, because I think if we have more energy and mental clarity more consistently, then we figure out how to do bigger exercise. But starting with the smallest amount of exercise is really important because it builds muscle mass. But the other piece that I want to go back to is if we're not getting protein in our diet throughout the day, we are eating our muscle mass in order to maintain our brain from flipping out, and we're lowering our metabolic rate, which is going to increase our obesity. Does this make sense to people? This is a slide that I really want people to get.
And while people are typing in, if they have any questions or any other comments, I'll just share that in the training room, the folks there said it woke them up and they went from a 6 to a 7 power supply.
Awesome. Yeah.
Other people said they enjoyed moving around and just, changing position a little bit. And so far the comment that we've received on chat is that, yeah, this slide is making sense.
Okay, great. And by the way, muscle mass burns fat mass, but we have to use our muscles to do this.
Yep. And so a few other comments and questions are coming in. So one person says they're starting the day with a hike where she does her best thinking and it just carries her through the day. Another person asks if people should be using weights. Does that increase the benefits? So if you're sitting in your chair flapping your arms, if you grabbed a hold of 3-pound weights, would that make a difference?
It would. And what I found is the more complicated it is, I would rather people be consistently inconsistent than perfect. Because perfect usually means I do it for a week and then I stop and I don't come back to it. So what I like people to do for their exercise is to have lots of different options, because we get bored. And so one of the things that's great about YouTube is there are office YouTube videos that you can do in 10 minutes, which are awesome. And the other thing that we need to do just is that for those of you who are old enough to have watched late night TV, there was something called P90X, and they talked about muscle confusion. And that's true, that like every 6 or 7 weeks, we need to do something a little different, or our body starts to hardwire in efficiencies, and so that exercise is not as beneficial. So for those of you who remember curves, people who started curves did great for the first year, and then some of them started gaining back their weight, and it was still good for their brain to move, but not necessarily their body, because they didn't change the pattern. And so I like to invest in learning new things with my body, because that helps my brain, and it helps my body not get too accommodated to doing the same thing. And for those of you who walking is the exercise, which is awesome, everybody should be able to walk, and figure out what your metric is. But in Seattle, there's something called Green Lake, and that's 3 miles, and that's sort of our metric to make sure everybody is doing that. But you have to also engage the upper body and do something with the upper body, particularly looking at the postural muscles, so that we can sit back and sit up straight, and not just, sometimes people are like, but I'm doing my arms. And I'm like, are you doing like yoga for your upper body, and particularly your torso? Mm-hmm. Okay, now we're gonna move into like, how do we use this information to make a difference in our lives and the lives of the children you're working with? So one of the things is making sure that we recognize lizard brain symptoms in ourselves and others. So being anxious, irritable, or agitated, I'm an expert at anticipating being anxious, irritable, or agitated, my particular form of it. Not hungry in the morning. This is very common with adolescents, as well as adults. But people are like, no, I'm not hungry. In fact, it makes me a little nauseous. Like, that doesn't make sense if you think about it on why they're not hungry in the morning. Because, I don't know, Thanksgiving's coming up, and in our house we have Thanksgiving at 1 o'clock, and I'm going to eat a lot of food at 1 o'clock, and I will guarantee you by 8 o'clock I will be hungry again, because insulin will have swept all those calories into cells, and now my brain's saying I need food again. So the signal of not being hungry in the morning means the adrenaline button has already been hit, because we are not wired to be hungry when we're running from the bear. That just doesn't make a lot of sense. And so, so that's another symptom. And then I bet that there's just a few people in the room who might be familiar with what I call the 3 a.m. committee meeting. Now, this might not be happening exactly at 3 a.m., but it's where you're up for 2 hours and then you go back to sleep. And it's very annoying. This is also a hypoglycemic event. Other lizard brain symptoms that you guys might run into with adolescents and kids is night terrors. When people have night terrors, what happens is their brain releases adrenaline. The adrenaline, the brain's like, wow, there's a lot of adrenaline, not tracking that was just to get some fuel to the brain, because the brain does a lot while we're asleep. And so the brain's like, wow, the last time we had all this adrenaline, this thing happened, and this thing happened, and this thing happened. We're going to mash it all together, and the bear's going to chase us all night, right? So that's a hypoglycemic event. And of course, panic attacks also count. So what can we do about that now that we know that we are having lizard brain symptoms partly driven because of what we ate and not something that happened in the past, or an immediate relationship that we're having. And that is that we eat protein more often. So when we have protein, and not just protein, really carbohydrates, a little bit of fat, a little bit of fiber, and protein in a meal, we have all of those things packaged together. Then we have a fuel supply that lasts 3 or 4 hours. We just doubled our brain's capacity to function, right? And by making sure that we get some protein in with our meals. Now, I've worked with people with severe PTSD. There are some people with severe PTSD that need to eat protein every 2 hours for 6 to 9 months, maybe a little longer, until their brain, part of recovering from PTSD is to lower the exposure of adrenaline. And once they lower the exposure to adrenaline by being in a safer environment and not getting hypoglycemic, they're able to get into their cortex more frequently, and then the cortex can sit down on their lizard brain. So what are the benefits for eating enough protein? So better sleep, less early morning waking, less fatigue, particularly in the afternoons, more energy, better moods, less depression and anxiety, higher metabolism, and hungry less frequently. So let's talk about the technology of lizard brain treats. This is what that caseworker was bringing to the foster care homes when she needed to take a foster care youth to some appointment. Is she would bring a tot box of juice that she got out of Trader Joe's, those little boxes of juice, and a handful of nuts. Trader Joe's also has little packets of nuts, and just distribute them. And it takes about 3 minutes to eat them, and they feel better. When a patient comes in and they're like, whoa, this happened, I like, juice, nuts? And the reason why we're doing the juice is because we need a refined carbohydrate that's immediately going to get to the brain to turn off the adrenaline button. And then the protein and the fats and the fiber and the nuts are to have a slow burning fuel. The problem that John was having, even though Snickers bars have nuts in them, is that it's mostly carbohydrates. And so he just burned through that. There was so much adrenaline or insulin that he wiped out the glucose really quickly, and then the adrenaline came in. Questions?
Yeah, so some of the questions I think have likely been answered, but I'm just gonna run through them, Kristen,
okay.
and then you can add to it. So one of the things that is you sort of just did a good intro for is how to address the not hungry in the morning issue.
Yeah. So not hungry in the morning. So if you're living without kids who are not hungry in the morning, or somebody who's not hungry in the morning, one of the things, like, I'm all about, let's do an experiment for 3 days, because people have to have the visceral understanding in themselves versus us imposing intellectual information on them. And so I often engage my clients, my patients, I call them clients, by saying, let's try an experiment for 3 days. And so, taking like a 1/4 cup of fruit juice, because you don't want 8 ounces of fruit juice, because that's just a lot of sugar. But a little bit of fruit juice, or I had one patient who just stuck her finger in the honey jar and then licked it off, and that's what she did. She lived by herself, so that wasn't too gross for everybody else in the house. Getting just a little bit of sugar, and what happens is your brain's going to be like, oh, okay, the cortex is now in charge, and we can make some decisions. We feel pretty better. And most people don't notice that switch. It takes a lot of practice to notice that switch from cortex to lizard brain and back again. But then 20 minutes later, as their glucose starts to decline, they'll have a hunger signal, and then they'll want to eat. And so that's kind of how I get around it. Or I start with them just starting with a protein shake, like an Odwalla or an Orgain protein shake. For some people, they're a little expensive, but it's a place to start. And it's got carbohydrates in it, and it's got protein in it, and they're good to go.
And does fruit work as well, like having an orange or an apple?
Maybe an orange will work, but an apple or a pear, it takes too long for your body to break the glucose out of the fiber. Mm-hmm. And some people can do like dried fruit that has fruit juice in it, but mostly for people, and part of what we need to distinguish is, is this information being used for somebody who has trauma, or is this being used for somebody who's pretty well adjusted and isn't under a lot of stress? I certainly have patients who have done well with carrots, but those are the people who are simply coming in for weight loss issues. And anyone who has a history of trauma, the juice is needed.
Mm-hmm. And so we did have a question about sort of better snacks for kids to help them engage or be more, sort of calmer. And I think the lizard brain treat touches on that. But do you want to talk a little bit more about that now, or?
Let's get through we're going to talk about how to read labels, and I think that's going to help us focus on what to do about treats.
Okay, great.
So we just finished the education point. The second point about Protein for All is champions, and these are people who understand why protein is important, and anybody can be a champion. And I really like this sign, is that we can all be a hero for one day, and we should start being a hero to ourselves and making sure that we're fueling ourselves first. Then once we've experienced it, it's much easier to talk to other people about it, and then become a connector to help everybody be at their best self by offering food with protein. And these are some of the parent allies from Spokane and the food donations that they've gotten for parents and families coming through dependency court. You can also join our community, the Protein for All community. We have a connectors group that happens most second Fridays of the month, except for December, but we have one coming up in November. And you can also sign up for our newsletter. I have a website, KristenAllett.com, and proteinforall.org has also a newsletter. There's some overlap in terms of content, but your support helps us move forward as a organization. Now we're going to get into protein snacks and the details of protein snacks. So reading labels is a little tricky. So some of you might actually have a label in your bag somewhere, because a lot of people carry food with them. But I have some labels that are commonly used around kids and people. And so when I was in school, I thought that a label should help me predict how I was going to feel. And what I was learning didn't really help me predict how I was going to feel. And so then I got on a bandwagon, because one of the things 15 years ago that everybody was taught to watch is this sugar line. And hopefully everybody can see the sugar line. Is this visible, Rosie? make sure I just want to make sure. Yes, okay, great, thank you. So the sugar line, so I wanted to know what this composed of, and this is actually a bureaucratic calculation, which is why sometimes I ate food and it was really sweet and it had not a lot of sugars in it, and then other times I ate food and it wasn't very sweet and it had a lot of sugars in it. It never made any sense. So I officially am crossing this line off. Do not pay attention to this sugar line. So when I pick up a label, the first thing I look at is how much protein is in it, because I understand that it's the protein that's going to give me long-term fuel. 3 grams is not a lot of protein. I just realized that I skipped a step, and I think I'm going to back up. Hopefully people have their handouts in terms of how much protein we should be getting. On the handout, Optimize Your Brain, it says how much protein you should be getting, which is about 8 grams for every 20 pounds of body weight. You can't see me standing, but usually when I stand in front of people notice that I'm about 6 foot. And as a 6 foot woman, that works out to be about 180 pounds, partly because I'm trying to put on muscle mass. And so that works out that I need about 80 grams of protein in a day. When we're looking at a label and there is 3 grams of protein, and I'm going to use this even as a snack or a meal, that's not very good. The other thing that I look at is how big of a serving is. And a serving is 2 bars. And so noticing, well, I would probably eat 2 bars, and so the 3 grams works for me. So the next thing that I look at is total carbohydrates. And so it's this line, total carbohydrates, which is 29 grams. And now, in order to kind of know how it's going to impact my body, what I want to do is I want to take anything that has fiber in it and subtract that. So that's 27. And so now I'm going to make a ratio of that calculated carbohydrate to the protein. So we got 27 divided by 3, and if my math is correct, that's a 9-to-1 ratio. That's pretty high. That's like in the dessert range. Generally, when things are healthy for us, it's somewhere between 1 and 3, maybe 1 and 4. So this would be a dessert, and I would assume that this kind of treat is going to last maybe 2 hours. And that makes sense because when we look at the ingredients content, we got oats, which is a carbohydrate. We got sugar, which is a carbohydrate. We've got rice flour, which is a carbohydrate. We got honey. We got salt, brown sugar, baking soda, lecithin. So maybe a little bit of nuts, but there's not a lot of protein in this. Is everybody following? We're going to do this one more time. So this is a Cliff Bar as another comparison. So first thing we're going to look at is protein, 9 grams of protein. Okay, we're getting somewhere. Then we're going to go over here and we're going to see how many servings there is. And so 1 bar is 1 serving. Okay, that's fair, because I would probably eat 1 bar. So if it says sometimes like cereals, if you look at cereal, I would encourage you to go to a grocery store and look at cereal boxes now that you know how to read a label. And like cereals, they'll say that a serving is 3/4 of a cup of cereal. I'm never going to eat 3/4 of a cup of cereal. Like I need to do a multiple of like 2 or 3, depending on the cereal. And so then you just multiply by how many times you're adding it. So then we're going to look at total carbohydrates. So the total carbohydrate is 44, but we're going to take away any fiber because the fiber is going to stay in our gut. So we got 44 minus 4, that's 40. Insoluble fiber is 3, so that's 37. And so 37 divided by 9 is a 4-to-1 ratio, roughly, right? The other thing that's worth looking at is what the ingredients lists are. What I like about Cliff Bars is that I can read it. Not all protein bars can you read what's in it. But again, there's some definite carbohydrates. They use protein soy isolate here. Okay, one more round. So this is a protein bar that probably you have to get online. It's my current favorite protein bar. It's a little more expensive. Cliff Bars are like $1. This is like $2.40. But let's check this out. So we got 20 grams of protein. Our carbohydrates are 20 grams of carbohydrates, but our fiber is 4. So we subtract that, that's 16. We're ignoring the sugar here. We're ignoring this. So now we're gonna do the ratio, which is 16 divided by 20. And I don't do percentages. I just call that less than 1-to-1. Check out these ingredients: almonds, honey, whey protein. Super simple. So what I like about this protein bar is that I can have this in my bag, and I can chip off a third of it and get, or half of it, and get 10 grams of protein as a snack. And I'm not getting a lot of carbohydrates. And I know that this will give me a long duration of protein and a little bit of carbohydrates. So let's talk about the protein bars that have no carbohydrates in it, because you're going to find protein bars that have lots of protein, 30 grams of protein, and no carbohydrates, because they use fake sugars. And that's really dangerous. I am not for fake sugars in any way, shape, or form, because then there's no fuel for our brain. So I was working with this executive woman who got referred into me because she was going to quit her job, and she was a partner at a firm, and she was going to quit because she was tired of crying all the time in the bathroom. And she was just like, I'm constantly on edge, and there's nothing going wrong. Like, I don't know why I'm going on edge. And I asked her what she ate, and she was eating a protein bar that had all protein in it, no carbohydrates, for breakfast and lunch, and then having a really good meal because she was trying to lose weight. And she was under a lot of stress. I was just like, let's switch out your protein bar and see if you feel better before you quit your job, because she wasn't fueling her brain. And what we agreed to was that she would come back and we would talk about it it was a Monday when I first met with her. On Wednesday, she would come back, and if she wanted to quit her job, we could talk about that. And she just called me on Tuesday, and she's like, I'm fine, thanks. No need to come in. I was like, okay, awesome. Any questions about reading labels?
Well, while you guys are typing them, if you have any, I'm just going to jump in, and a couple of the questions are actually answered in that worksheet that Kristen just had up, the Optimizing Brains worksheet, in terms of what is a good gauge for grams of protein per pound of body weight. There's a table right in that worksheet, as well as the question around, options if people have nut allergies or better snacks for kids, and all of that kind of thing. Though there's a lot on that same worksheet, there's a list of different food items and suggestions and how much protein they have in them. And so I think a lot of those kinds of, if we have time, we can circle back around to it. But I think a lot of those types of questions are just really readily answered in that worksheet. Yeah, and so the other thing that I'll just say, and then there's a couple more questions for you, Kristen, but is that sugar line that Kristen said to sort of ignore in the labels, that's really reading labels for supporting mental health.
I don't think anybody should pay attention to the sugars line. This line here that says 21.
Mm-hmm.
It is so biased and inaccurate to the physiological experience that it is far better for you to pay attention to the total carbohydrates and the fiber and figure out how that feels in your body. But this is not a line that anybody can pay attention to and predict how they're going to feel.
Great. And then are you familiar with using monk fruit as a sugar substitute for someone who has diabetes?
Yeah. Monk fruit, stevia, and even aspartame, all of those are, you have to make sure that you are careful on an individual level, because we need carbohydrates to feel good. The other thing that we have to be careful about is when, so diet soda, partly because I want to finish, part of what I think we're going to do is finish the slide deck and then do questions, and I wanted to make sure that we could dialogue a lot. But if you look at studies around diet soda, the rates of cardiovascular disease and diabetes is the same as people who are drinking soda. They're just less obese. And part of that is that when we taste and eat something that is sweet, we still get an insulin hit because the body is expecting sugar. And so I'm pretty careful with people who are doing that, and they have to test that within their body. I think it's really worth collecting data, keeping things low cost and collecting data, even on an individual level, like even if it's just for your own self, in that how many kids are, when you go and connect to them, just ask them, like, when was the last time you ate, and what was it? And start seeing if you see trends in how they behave and what their emotional regulation is and how engaged they are with you based on what they're eating. And then it's not imposing it on them, but it's also being like, hey, I have an experiment. Do you want to try this? But I just want to show you some of the data that we got collected at one of the courts for dependency courts, so the shelter care hearings. This is the first court hearing for parents who are coming in. And the parent Alice asked, when did they last eat? And 12% of the parents coming in had protein, 30, but basically 86% of them either had carbs, which are going to be wiped away within 2 hours riding on the bus, or they didn't eat at all. And did you bring food today? Most people didn't think to bring food because they didn't expect to be in shelter care, and planning ahead and just getting there is hard. And they didn't know that they were going to be there all day, and they didn't know that there wasn't going to be food. What we find is that people who had food that day, 63% accepted a protein bar, and they're just being offered a protein bar. And those who hadn't eaten since the day before mostly accepted protein bar, these are pretty big numbers, because a lot of the parents come in pretty concerned that they're in an adversarial environment, and they are willing to accept the food because they know it'll help. And it's explained to them, this will help your brain be solution oriented. And the parents' lawyers are also really promote the use of protein, because they are better able to have conversations about the case and versus them being really reactive. And then collecting the data on what happens to you. So it's wonderful that all of you have chosen to be CASA volunteers, and it's a lot of training and it's a lot of work, and making sure that you know what will increase your energy by 15%. And what is that list, and keeping that list for yourself in your wallet. Like, because I know that when I'm burnt out, like, I can't think of anything, right? But, is it go for a walk? get something to eat with protein, call my sister, pray. Like what are your top 3 things that you know is going to help? Because we often forget when we are in the mode of caring for others, we forget to care for ourselves, and it's very typical. So now we can do questions.
So one is about if labels only give percents and not grams, how can you sort of sort out how to figure out if it's good for you or not, or how it'll make you feel?
It does give grams. So let's check this out. So let's look at the Cliff Bar. So a Cliff Bar is 9 grams of protein. And so if I'm trying to get 80 grams of protein in a day, that means if I'm only using Cliff Bars for my food source, I'm going to have to eat 9 of them. That would be a sad day. So let's go over the handout real briefly. So a deck of cards is 20 grams of protein. A deck of cards of meat is 20 grams of protein. And so for me to get 80 grams of protein in a day, I need to have 20 grams of protein for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then I need to have, and so that gets me to 60, and then I need to have 10 grams in terms of a snack. And so if you look at the chart that looks like this, which has different protein sources, you can start to guesstimate your protein amount, or you could use, there's a app called MyFitnessPal, and you can just put in your food and it'll calculate your protein. But so, for instance, I had chicken sausage for breakfast, and so that was 20 grams. And then because I was doing this, I had a little bit of a protein bar because I wanted to make sure I was well fueled for this. So that was another 10 grams. Probably going to go home and have a salad with some meat in it. That will be another 20 grams of protein. Sometimes I just do a quick handful of nuts. A handful of nuts is 8 grams. That's close enough, and call that good. And then for dinner, I will have another piece of meat. Sometimes I will use tofu, and solid tofu is a lot like meat. For the vegetarians, it's a little more tricky because for instance, beans, a half cup of beans is 8 grams. So to get to 20 grams of protein with beans, you got to eat a cup and a half of beans and then get other food in. Or quinoa is a really good protein source to know about. Half cup is 11 grams. Eggs are 7 grams. And so part of what you try and do is just start tracking how much protein that you're eating. And if you want to do an experiment for your own energy and mental clarity, you can do the experiment on the back side of the street, which is what I call 3 days of protein, where you're just eating protein every 3 to 4 hours, but 3 hours usually. Particularly for people in high stress situations or who have a history of PTSD or are not exercising, it tends to be shorter. And then and see what happens when you're sure your body's not releasing adrenaline for food reasons. Because you're not with the kids all the time, partly what we also want to problem solve around is making sure that you're just helping kids get protein in while they're with you. And you can explain the technology. Working with kids and getting protein in throughout the day is hard with the most organized parents. But helping them make better decisions in the moment is also helpful.
Mm-hmm. So we have a number of other questions.
Sure.
One is, and a couple are about intermittent fasting and what you think about that, and also is it more specifically like does the body need a prolonged break from having to digest and process food, or what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So there's a couple of recent blog posts that I will refer you to for more information. And maybe Natasha will just put a link up for you so that you can capture that. But so the diet that I'm talking about right now is specifically for people who have a history of mental health or trauma, because it is so important when people are in recovery from mental health and trauma to not have adrenaline exposure. What happens is there's a part of our brain called the amygdala, which is in our lizard brain. And when we get exposed to trauma or early childhood trauma, even if it was 50 years ago, our amygdala is chock full of receptors looking for adrenaline. And the slightest bit of adrenaline sets off a cascade of events that forces people to be acting in their lizard brain, which is about the past and not about the present or the future. And so I have not seen people be successful with intermittent fasting when they are still working through trauma. And they may be successful with paleo, where they're eating a lower carb diet, but still getting carbohydrates in, not necessarily a keto diet, but a lower carb diet, lots of protein, lots of fats. I do like the information around intermittent fasting and going, 8 to 12 hours without eating and letting your system, your digestive system rest and your hormonal system rest. That is a good idea if your brain will rest. And if your brain will not rest and sends you into sympathetic mode every time your glucose gets low, then you get yourself into more trouble. So part of it is a prioritization of what needs to happen. The people, and how people know is they'll try intermittent fasting and they will fail at it. And I don't want them to fail at it and feel shame about it, but they will do intermittent fasting and they will find that they're binge eating, or they're breaking the fast because their emotions are so erratic. Or what's really sad to me is they'll start reaching for other things to manage their emotions, and drugs and internet and maladaptive behaviors come in. And so I would rather keep people with a history of mental health on a really even glucose supply until they've done the therapy and enough new behaviors and healed their body and gotten enough protein on them, enough muscle mass on them, and got exercising and able to sleep well and have a job and do well in life and be able to get their goals done, and then lean into the intermittent fasting later on, perhaps for health issues, but it's not a one size fits all.
Great, thank you. And if anyone has follow-up questions, feel free to type them in, but we're going to go ahead and address a couple other questions while you're doing that. So one person says that they work with 2 kids who are placed in a family that uses sugar as a reward for all kinds of outcomes. They're professional, highly educated family, both of the parents and the family. But they find that when they're not offering something sweet as a treat or a reward, that they get really cranky kids on their hands. And so if you have any suggestions about how to sort of educate and extend some of this to the foster family in terms of the actual effects of using sugar as a reward.
Yeah. So there's this this rule about the brain: what happens together wires together. And so when you have cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect, and you wire those again and together, you will get an immediate reaction. So I'm going to give you an example. This won't work with all of you, but we're going to do a thought experiment. And I would love for you to type in your reaction as we work through the thought experiment. So the first thought experiment is, could you imagine that if I asked you for 3 days to either chew gum or use breath mints 3 or 4 or 5 times a day, would that be possible? Like, just possible. And I'm getting lots of yeses. Possible? It's possible. Okay. So here's the next thought experiment. During those 3 days, I want you to not brush your teeth. Is that possible? No way, I'm out. No, 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 thank you very much, right? So what has been hardwired in, what has wired together is you get up, you brush your teeth. And some of you, when you go to bed, you brush your teeth. And maybe you brush your teeth at lunch. And that is hardwired in. And it's so hardwired in, you cannot even imagine not doing it, even though we know that your teeth are not going to fall out in 3 days and you're not going to offend anyone because I just gave you breath mints, right? And so I just want to point out that you all who said no have a hardwired addiction to brushing your teeth. And when somebody's trying to give up an addiction, may it be to alcohol or substances or sugar, it's that hardwired in. And so this is gonna seem like a non sequitur to what that, and I promise I'll come back to the question about the sugar. So I was working with somebody, I was a wellness director at an addiction treatment center, and one woman came in and she's like, I don't understand why my sister can have 1 glass of wine and I can never drink wine again in my life. And I was just like, okay, let's just do a quick survey. What did you do with when you celebrated? Did you, like, what was alcohol involved when you celebrated? Yes. And was alcohol around when you were sad? Yes. And was alcohol around when you were mad? Yes. Bored? Yes. And so when something is always there, it gets hardwired in, much like brushing your teeth. And to challenge it, your lizard brain goes crazy, even to imagine that. So part of what the parents are doing is hardwiring in that their kids get a treat when they, as a reward. Right? And so and you can get an addiction on anything. I, for like 7 years, would go home and watch court TV at lunch, and then my television died, and I actually had withdrawal symptoms, and my brain, your brain says things to you that are lies and dumb ideas, right? My brain actually was like, we have a key to Taryn's house and we should break into her house and go watch court TV for lunch. And I'm like, oh, I'm addicted to court TV. Oh my God. Because I had just done it over and over again. And so how you break an addictive pattern is you make sure that there's choice. So when I go home for lunch, I can watch court TV, I can call a friend, or I can listen to NPR, or I can read a book. And I have to exercise all 4 of those options in a week. So I don't know what you can do with this foster family. You might be able to educate them, but certainly you can practice this in your own lives, is that when you see that you're hardwiring something, then you have to come up with other options. And so just like what we did with John, the kid who got in trouble because of Snickers bars, is you can have a treat, you can have a toy, right? Or maybe I'll read with you for 10 minutes. And you give them choice and say that they have to exercise all 3 choices on their reward over a given week. Does that make sense?
Yes.
See a yes.
So another question we had was if you can just go over again how to figure out how much protein a person should eat in a day.
Yeah, sorry I wasn't more explicit about that in this talk, but so on this Optimize Your Brain handout, First, you want to look up, there's a chart, and you want to look and see, based on your weight, your actual weight, not your ideal body weight, but your actual weight, how much protein you should be getting in a day. Some people are like, oh, well, I'm 140 pounds, but I should be 120 pounds, so I'm going to look at 120 pounds. No, if you're 140 pounds and your natural BMI for your height is 120 pounds, two things are happening. Either you're like my friend Jim, who's 6'3" and 280 and ripped, and he still has to eat the protein for the 280 because he works out a lot and is in really good shape and eats a small cow every day. Or perhaps the reason why you're not 120 pounds is because you're a little rounder. And often when we start getting round, we start losing muscle mass. And so we want to make sure that we're eating the amount of protein for our size so that we can add muscle mass. And I'll warn you that if you try this experiment, you may put on, the scale may add 5 pounds, but your pants are still going to feel the same because muscle weighs more than fat. I kind of max out if somebody who's listening to this is over 200 pounds and you're starting to calculate your target weight. I get uncomfortable when people are eating more than 120 grams of protein. I know statistically speaking that because of paleo and CrossFit and ketogenic diet that people can go higher than that. I think it's worth having a physician on board if you're going to go higher than that. And by the way, if you're eating 120 grams of protein, that is 6 decks of cards of meat. That is a lot of meat. And you can, unless you're working out a lot, you can only absorb 20 grams per hour. So having a steak, a 10-ounce steak, like only 3 of those ounces is going to go to metabolism and brain smartness, and the other 7 ounces is going to go to fat tissue. So I'm a little mixed on people eating 10-ounce steaks. So part of what you have to do for your own self is divide it throughout the day. Then this template on 3 days of protein, that works out to be about 65 grams of protein. And 65 grams of protein divided throughout the day is usually enough to just help energy and mental clarity, which is the focus of our topic. And the rounding it up to whatever your ideal body weight protein, that's more around maintaining weight and perhaps losing weight, but that's a hard conversation. Weight loss is really complex, but making sure we're not gaining more weight is possible. And so then we're just making sure we're getting protein with carbs, fat, and fiber at every meal, and so that our glucose supply flattens out. Does that cover the question?
I think it would. And Kristen, just correct me if I'm wrong, but these are based on just the RDA recommended daily allowances.
So
not anything crazy.
These protein recommendations are 100-year-old US RDA recommendations. These are not me coming up with something special. This is RDA, and the research coming out, the leading research coming out for the what scientifically elderly population, which I will be in 5 years because I'm 51, and when you turn 55, you're scientifically elderly, is they're going to double the amount of that protein. What they're finding is the elderly population really needs a lot of protein in order to maintain their cognitive skills, as well as preventing diabetes and obesity. So this is really like basic levels of protein.
Another question is about the difference between habit and addiction. And is it just like a value, like a habit is something positive and addiction is something negative? Or is there actually a different, like with your toothbrushing example, is how do you distinguish between habit and addiction?
So an addiction to me is something that is affecting your is starting to impact your ability to earn a living or go to school, your health, or your relationships. Your relationships are starting to say that's a problem. So, for instance, I had a patient come in whose habit of toothbrushing had crossed over into an addiction because he was brushing his teeth so much and so hard that he was stripping his gums, and he had to have gum surgery. We can do that with exercise. We can do that with watching TV and Facebook. We can, where we cannot flex for it for a day. Like if let's go back to the toothbrushing. Let's say you woke up in the morning and your child was sick and you had to rush them to the hospital, but you're not going to leave the house because you haven't brushed your teeth. Really? I think that's crossed over because you can't flex, right? And so when I think my brain is starting to make something into an addiction, I will challenge it and see if I actually have choice around it. And it just needs to be a little bit of choice, but it needs to be choice. One of the questions that came up, because we have about 15 minutes, and I don't think we fully talked about this, but I do want to talk about snacks for kids, and go back to snacks for kids. Is this an okay timing? And then I'll come back to some of the other questions.
Yeah.
So snacks for kids. So snacks for kids are really challenging. So if you're in the so I'm good for the three and up. The younger kids, I think, is not my expertise, but the 3 and up. So with like the 3 to 5-year-old range, if nuts are out, another thing that you can try is cheese sticks. Cheese sticks seems to work pretty well with the younger kids. And so that would be a place to go. You can do fruit and seed butter versus nut butters, right? So like sesame seed or sunflower seed sometimes work if the nut butters are out. In terms of treats, just meat roll-ups, getting some meat and rolling them up and maybe a slice of cheese. As people get older, maybe 12, 16, certainly by 16, what I'm seeing in my office is that cheese and milk are not protein sources. I just made a whole bunch of you sad. Sorry. So if you're in the habit of having a cheese sandwich for lunch, that is not sufficient protein. And how I register that is that what I'm seeing is the pasta dairy vegetarians who are using primarily milk as a protein source. When I look at their blood supply of protein, it is not sufficient. And we outgrow our ability to break down. And I don't have the science behind it, but what I think it is the lactose is mucking up our ability to absorb protein. Little kids do okay, but the older kids and adults do not. Then, and this is where food is really challenging in that, like, we're in a world where some people need to be gluten-free and some people need to be nut-free, and you can't bring nuts into a school, and so, and so part of it is problem solving around that. And I don't have all the answers. There are protein bars that you can get. That's why I like Cliff Bars, is they don't have a lot of nuts. There is some, if people are allergic, it's a problem, but it's low content. And so a lot of people can get away with it. There's not nuts. It's easy to buy at Trader Joe's, and unless people are super sensitive to wheat, they do okay. But it takes some problem solving, and really what it takes is dialoguing with people and families to find out what they're interested in eating, and using this chart to like up the protein within the context of their family. I'm not answering a really direct question because one of the things that I am really opposed of is people eating stuff that they don't like because it's nutritious for them. Like that is a setup for all sorts of things. So is that enough information for you guys to move forward on snacks for kids? It's still a struggle for me because it's so individualized.
Maybe while people are thinking about that, yeah, it looks like there's some yes, we think so, and taking protein snacks for lunch. So that's something to work on. So, okay, good. So there's a bunch of yeses coming in for that. We had a couple questions, and I'm going to group them together because they both have to do with systems sort of outside of what we may feel we have control over. So I just figure I'm gonna throw them out there, and we'll see where the conversation goes. So one of the questions was if you have any suggestions for teenagers who skip lunch because the food at the school is terrible and their foster placement doesn't want to provide the child with a bag lunch. And then the question that I'm going to sort of lump that with that came earlier on is sort of like all of these implications for kids at school, both in terms of diet and getting adequate, or so, providing opportunities for adequate exercise throughout the day. So
I'm going to go back to this slide. With teenagers, I think that it's really talking to them about what their goals are. And is it as easy to get to their goals by not eating as when they eat? And so dialoguing with them about how their afternoon goes and how they're doing in school, if that's a goal of theirs. Now it has to be their goal. Like they may not be personally invested in school, but finding something that they're personally invested in, and having those conversations, and finding that goal that they really want, and then pointing out that now that they have a goal, what are the steps you need to get there? Okay, they've got the steps they get to need there, and usually you have to do them over and over and over again. Like let's say they want to learn to play an instrument, right? Well, okay, they're personally invested in it, and they got the instrument, and they know that they need to practice 20 minutes every day. Like, is it easier to practice when they've been fed or when they have not been fed? That's really interesting. It's harder to practice. They're more interested in being on their phone than practicing, but it's easier to practice when they get fed. Okay, now that they've learned that lesson, then applying it to other lessons on like, where else are you not getting fed? And that is hampering your ability to get things done. I think having those conversations, and then doing things as simple as like, I had one kid who didn't want to eat the food when we were working in crisis, but he would eat anything that was just blistering hot. And so like, how do you take some cayenne sauce and get some food in? Like sometimes it's just like being curious around that moment and saying like, is there anything else you can do? And you can sit down with our website and these handouts and be like, hey, because as sad as it was sometimes when I was working with kids, like we were like, like your parents aren't going to get it together, and like there are some adults around you who are going to help you to do it, but like you get to do it. Like, what do you want to do? And when we actually empowered those kids to to move their lives forward, they were much more creative about using the brain smart nutrition. I don't know if that answers the question, but with adolescents, I would start with what they can control. And because telling them to eat lunch just because, then you're just setting up a power dynamic and you're going to lose. Did I miss anything, Natasha?
No, I think that was a great answer. There was sort of this larger question about implications, like in the school in general, but
Yeah, so
I think a lot of what you said relates.
you know, I had one teacher who was working with kids that, you know, this was like their last classroom before they got kicked out of school, and she brought in protein snacks, nuts, not peanuts but almonds, and restraints went down and behavioral problems went down. 8 weeks, she did 8 weeks, like, here's the numbers. She went to the school and said, you know, I've been paying that out of pocket. I would like you to pay for it. And because of the federal laws, it couldn't be done. So I don't know. Like, you have to be really deep into a school system to figure that out. I don't know. I have written prescriptions for kids that they needed to have access to protein snacks, and so the nurse had, you know, almonds that they would come in and eat a handful of almonds at 10:30 and at 1:30.
Someone said that the foster child they're working with was on the list for food therapy, but that can take some time as well, and so that's another. I don't think that was around when I was in school, but that sounds like a great thing. And it sounds similar to what you were just saying in terms of having a prescription for specific food that will help. But then, you know, hopefully there's other, like, if you're in that position and you're on the waiting list, hopefully some of the other suggestions Kristen was able to provide will give you ideas of snacks in the interim. We just have a few minutes left. I have posted in the chat box the link to the CASA Maricopa webpage. That's where I'll post this video, so you all will be able to either share it or have access to it again. So that webpage will be up, and I'll also post some links to other, you know, some of the other resources that are like the blog posts that are relevant that we talked about.
And also, as we're wrapping, if you have questions or stories, we're a new movement and we want to spread. And so if you happen to try this and you're like, oh my God, like, this really helped this, and you want to take the time and share that story, that's really helpful, because what we're hoping that we're going to be moving towards is becoming a nonprofit so that we can get funding to make this information more accessible to more people. And your support is really helpful. And so I hope that this has been helpful not only to you, but also the kids that you work with. And again, I really thank you for the time that you take to work with these kids, because it really does, relationship, food's important, but relationships also really important. And if you want to type in like what information you're taking home as we wrap up, I would love to hear, like, what's the best aha that you're going to take home or try, and then we'll wrap up for the day. And maybe, Rosie, you can just have people name that, because I think naming like what we're going to take home embeds that a little deeper into what we might actually do.
And so one person posted better reading of labels and different snack options.
Awesome.
Information about the fake sugars was very useful. Recognizing the impact of hunger or malnourishment on the parents as they are faced with formal situations made her more sad, but also more aware.
Great. Thank you for sharing.
One last clarification. Is it carbs minus fiber to protein?
Yeah, so it's total carbs minus fiber, and that calculated carbs is the numerator and the denominator is protein. And that, you should have a handout for that. And there's also a full blog and video, if you want, on kristenallen.com, and we'll put a link to that as well.
Yeah, there's also on the Protein for All webpage, there is an education page that has a lot more handouts, and also the videos and podcasts that go along with some of the handouts. So that's another resource that you can find pretty quickly, probably.
Thank you so much.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.